Won't have a writing for me. Maybe. Just some things are discreet. Oh, pretty you. I'm not singing random stuff because I want to get stuff taken care of. And I hate you guys to have no audio to come into. So I just come on here and say, hey, what up? What? Stream Elements is actually doing the right thing for us. It's doing some no support. I mean, admittedly, I would doubt it because it's the first line of a very famous story. Guess I could be singing different songs, but whatever song I damn well please. That's the first two call for requests that I actually know anything. Okay. Not that I'm going to use my PNG, but I'm going to be on Discord nonetheless. None the greater, none the worse. Good device, microphone, output device, sets. This video, your studio game. Ah. Afternoon's gonna come in. Hey. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, since I'm on, I guess I will go ahead and switch over to the chatting screen because, hey, I'm chatting. Chatting to myself. So, I was going to say, I do have stuff that I'm working on. Hopefully it's going to be cool and all you cubs are going to like it, but I would work on it more this weekend, but I'm going to be visiting in-laws, I guess. Not my in-laws, but my sister's in-laws. Family reunion. Clayton, Oklahoma. Imbibing some water. Remember, dark chocolate is supposed to be able to kill dogs and wolves, but it also takes a great quantity of it. And honestly, this Tony's is pretty damn good. Just wish I had better fracture lines to make it a lot easier to eat. That's the first time in a while I've started this up, watching someone else stream at the same time. Snare's on. Snare is indeed on. Oh, Cascadia's on too. I didn't know that she had a web series. That's pretty cool. Snare's on the back screen. And let's see. What did it? Really wish this cub could get some more people. Best cub. He's honestly been trying to get it for it a little bit longer than I have, as far as I can tell. And he even completely reset himself to try to start over. So it would be really cool if people could go and support him. Because he is a pretty good cub. I do apologize if my eyes look like they're looking over things, because I'm looking over my camera to the screen. Because I'm using my phone as my camera, because I finally figured out that I was apparently working too hard to get things to work. And when I just did things like absolutely basic level. Oh, excuse me. Damn, excuse me. I think that was all of them. Okay. But anyway. Do something really weird real quick. Okay. Hi there. See you over there. Over there. Okay. I'm gonna have to adjust my model where it is again, but hey. I didn't like showing the full model because Fanartsy did a great fucking job on that model. I mean, you know, I don't want to hold back. Fanartsy, and Leo, as we know him, did an awesome job on the model. Just my position on the screen. Okay, so you look that down. Anyway, how long have we been doing? We are only 10 minutes in. Okay. Hey, I have to look around my camera because I can't see my screen. I only have the one monitor set up because I'm using my laptop to do this. And if I was on my tower, I've got a separate camera on it, and that camera works a little bit better than my phone. But, yeah. Yeah, I really wish people could go follow Kayla. Follow Kayla, get him some views, get the Cubs some good watch time. I mean, he doesn't really schedule all that much, but, you know, when you have no control over your schedule, you can't control your schedule. So, I guess since they're so busy right now, that gives you a preview of what I've kind of got coming up. So, quick flash. Okay, that's what I get. That is all you get. No, it's Nightbot's awake. Oh, that's not that. Okay. And something else I've been working on. Just, you know, a little. And animation's a little rough, but I haven't exactly had a lot of time to put into it yet. But, spooky. Riding. Okay. Get up there. Okay. Let's see. One last flash, just for the hell of it. Whoa. Okay, enough of that. What time is it? It is 14. I'm going to switch over this reading screen. So, Cubs. Since I finished the books I had been reading last week and I didn't start the new book yesterday, we are going to start back into other fairy tales. And hopefully, they're not going to bitch about me using the book cover, because I'm doing this one. Hello. My ambient is a little loud. You knew that, right? All of you. One person troubling me out there. But we are 15 minutes in, so that means it is time to start reading. So, I will look down here at my wonderful book. And sound alerts and stuff are on, so if you come in, hopefully I'll hear you. Hopefully. But, oh look, a wild goat name. Amazing that a fish would be the first one to come in, since I'm about to read The Little Mermaid. And I'm not just walking in a winter wonderland. Okay, that's just corny. Fix model position again. So I keep... Hello. I thought I dropped something. Okay. So, Little Mermaid. Far out in the wide sea, where the water is blue as the loveliest cornflower, and as clear as the purest crystal, or it is so deep that very, very many church towers could be heaped one upon another in order to reach the lowest depth of the surface above. There dwell, the mer people. Now, mic adjust, sorry. Now, you must not imagine that there is nothing but sand below the water. No, indeed, far from it. Trees and plants of wondrous beauty grow there, whose stems and leaves are so light that they are waved to and fro by the slightest motion of the water, almost as if they were living beings. Fishes, great and small, glide in and out among the branches, just as birds fly among our leaves. Where the water is deepest stands the palace of the Mer-King. The walls of his palace are coral, and the high, pointed windows are of amber. The roof, however, is composed of mussel shells, which, as the billows pass over them, are continually opening and shutting. This looks exceedingly pretty, especially each of those mussel shells contains a number of bright, glittering pearls, one only of which would be the most common ornament of the diadem of a king of the upper world. The Mer-King, who lived in this palace, had been for many years a widower. His old mother managed the household affairs for him. She was, on the whole, a sensible sort of lady, although extremely proud of her high birth and station, on which account she wore 12 oysters on her tail, whilst the other inhabitants of the sea, whose even those distinction were allowed only 6. In every other respect she merited unlimited praise, especially for the affection that she showed for her 6 little princesses, her granddaughters. They were all very beautiful children. The youngest was, however, the most lovely. Her skin was as soft and delicate as a rose leaf. Her eyes were of the deep blue as the sea, and, like all other mermaids, she had no feet. Her body ended in a tail like that of a fish. The whole day long the children used to play in the spacious apartments of the palace, where beautiful flowers grew out of the walls on all sides around them. When the great amber windows were opened, fishes could swim in the apartments as swallows fly in your rooms. But the fishes were bolder than the swallows. They swam straight up to the little princesses, ate from their hands, and allowed themselves to be caressed. In front of the palace there was a large garden, full of fiery red and blue trees, whose fruit glittered like gold, and whose flowers resembled a bright, burning sun. The sand that formed the soil of the garden was of a bright blue color, something like flames of sulphur, and had a strangely beautiful blue that was spread over the whole, so that one might have fancied oneself raised very high in the air, with the sky at once above and below. fix my camera. It's, I can't be staring down all the time. Yep. Had a better chair. I guess I could be, but that's beside the point. Anyway. When the waters were quite still, and the sun might be seen looking like a purple flower, out of the whole cup streamed forth the light of the world. Each of the little princesses had their own plot in the garden, where she might plant and sow at her pleasure. One chose hers to be made in the shape of a whale, another preferred the figure of a mermaid, and the youngest had hers quite round like the sun, and planted in it only those flowers that were red, as the sun seemed to her. She was certainly a singular child, very quiet and thoughtful. Whilst her sisters were adorning themselves with all sorts of gay things that came out of a ship which had been wrecked, she asked for nothing but a beautiful white marble statue of a boy which had been found in it. She put the statue in her garden and planted a red weeping willow by its side. The tree grew quickly and let its long boughs fall upon the bright blue ground, where ever-moving shadows played in violet hues as if the boughs and roots were embracing. Nothing pleased the little princess more than to hear about the world of human beings living above the sea. She made her old grandmother tell her everything she knew about ships, towns, men, and land animals, and was particularly pleased when she heard that the flowers of the upper world had a pleasant fragrance, for the flowers of the sea are scentless, and that the woods were green, and the fishes fluttering among the branches of various gay colors, and that they could sing with a loud, clear voice. The old lady meant birds, but she called them fishes, because for her grandchildren, having never seen a bird, would not otherwise have understood her. "When you have attained your 15th year," added she, "you will be permitted to rise to the surface of the sea. You will then sit by moonlight in the clefts of the rocks, see the ships sail by, and learn to distinguish towns and men." The next year the eldest of the sisters reached this happy age, but the others, alas! The second sister was a year younger than the eldest, the third a year younger than the second, and so on. The youngest had still 5 whole years to wait till that joyful time she could come when she might rise to the surface of the water, see what was going on in the upper world. However, the eldest promised to tell the others of everything she might see, when the first day of her being of age arrived, for her grandmother gave them but little information, and there was so much that they wished to hear. But none of all the sisters longed so ardently for the day when she would be released from childish restraint as the youngest. She who had the longest to wait, and was so quiet and thoughtful. Many a night she stood by the open window, looking up through the clear blue water, whilst the fishes were leaping and playing about her. She could see the sun and the moon. Their light was pale, but they appeared larger than they do to those who live in the upper world. If a shadow passed over them, she knew it must be either a whale or a ship sailing by, full of human beings, who indeed little thought that, far beneath them, the little mermaid was passionately stretching forth her white hands towards their ship's keel. The day had now arrived when the eldest princess had attained her 15th year, and was therefore allowed to rise up to the surface of the sea. When she returned, she had 1,000 things to relate. Her chief pleasure had been to sit upon the sandbank in the moonlight, looking at the large town which lay on the coast, where lights were beaming like stars, and where music was playing. She had heard that distant noise of men and carriages. She had seen the high church towers, had listened to the ringing of bells, and just because she could not go there, she longed the more after all these things. How attentively did her younger sister listen to her words! And when she next stood at night time by her open window, gazing upon through the blue waters, she thought so intensely of the great noisy city that she fancied she could hear the church bells ringing. The next year, the second sister received permission to swim wherever she pleased. She rose to the surface of the sea just when the sun was setting, and the sight so delighted her that she declared it to be more beautiful than anything she had seen above the waters. The whole night sky seemed tinged with gold, said she, and it is impossible for me to describe to you the beauty of the clouds. Now red, now violet, they glided over me, but still more swiftly flew over the water a flock of white swans, just where the sun was descending. I looked after them, but the sun disappeared, and the bright rosy light of the surface of the sea and on the edges of the clouds had gradually extinguished. It was now time for the third sister to visit the upper world. She was the boldest of the six, and ventured up a river. On its shores she saw green hills covered with woods and vineyards, from among which arose houses and castles. She heard the birds singing, and the sun shone with such power that she was continually obliged to plunge below in order to cool her burning face. In a little bay she met with a number of children, who were bathing and jumping about. She would have joined in their gambols, but the children fled back to land in great terror, and a little black animal barked at her in such a manner that she herself was frightened at last, and swam back to the sea. She could not, however, forget the green woods, and the rolling hills, and the pretty children, who, although they had no fins, were swimming about in the river so fearlessly. The fourth sister was not so bold. She remained in the open sea, and said on her return home that she thought nothing could be more beautiful. She had seen ships sailing by, so far off that they looked like great seagulls, and she had watched the merry dolphins gambolling in the water, and the enormous whales sending up into the air 1,000 sparkling fountains. The year after, the fifth sister attained her 15th year. Her birthday happened at a different season than that of her sisters. It was winter. The sea was a green color, and immense icebergs were floating on its surface. These, she said, looked like pearls. They were, however, much larger than a church tower on the land, and the human beings. She sat down upon one of these pearls and let the wind play with her long hair. But when the ships hoisted their sails in terror and escaped as quickly as possible. In the evening the sky was covered with sails, and whilst the great mountains of ice alternately sank and rose again, and beamed with a reddish glow, flashes of lightning burst forth from the clouds, and the thunder rolled on, pearl after pearl. The sails of all the ships were instantly furled, and horror and affright reigned on board. But the princess sat still on the iceberg, looking unconcernedly at the blue zigzag of the flashes. The first time that either of the sisters rose out of the sea, she was quite enchanted at the sight of so many new and beautiful objects. But the novelty was soon over, and it was not long ere their own home appeared more attractive than the upper world. For there only did they find everything agreeable. Many an evening would the five sisters rise in hand from the depths of the ocean. Their voices were far sweeter than any human voice, and when a storm was coming in, they would swim in front of the ships and sing. Oh, how lovely they did sing, describing the happiness of those who lived at the bottom of the sea, and entreating the sailors not to be afraid, but to come down to them. The mariners, however, did not understand their words. They fancied the song was only a whistling of the wind, and thus they lost the hidden glories of the sea. For if their ships were wrecked, all on board were drowned, and none but dead men ever entered the Mer-King's palace. Whilst the sisters were swimming at evening time, the youngest would remain motionless and alone in her father's palace, looking up at them. She would have wept, but mermaids cannot weep, and therefore, when they are troubled, suffer infinitely more than humans do. Oh, if I were but 15, sighed she, I would know that I should love the upper world and its inhabitants so much. At last the time she had longed for arrived. Well, now it is your turn, said the grandmother. Come here, that I may adorn you like your sisters. And she wound around her hair a wreath of white lilies, whose every petal was half of a pearl. Then she commanded 8 large oysters to fasten themselves to the princess's tail, in token of her high rank. But that is so very uncomfortable, said the little princess. One must not mind slight inconveniences when one wishes to look well, said the old lady. How willingly would the princess have given up all this splendor, and exchanged her heavy crown for the red flowers of her garden, which were so much more becoming of her. But she dared not do so. Farewell, she said, and she rose from the sea, light as a flake of foam. When, for the first time in her life, she appeared on the surface of the water, the sun had just sunk below the horizon. The clouds were beaming with bright golden and rosy hues. The evening star was shining in the pale western sky. The air was mild and refreshing, and the sea was as smooth as the looking-glass. A large ship with 3 masts lay on the still waters. One sail only unfurled, but not breathing, while not a breath was stirring. And the sailors were quietly seated on the cordage and ladders of the vessel. Music and song resounded from the deck, and after it grew hundreds of lamps all of a sudden burst forth into light, whilst innumerable flags were fluttering on overhead. The little mermaids swam up to the captain's cabin, and every now and then, when the ship was raised by the motion of the water, she could look through the clear window panes. She saw within many richly dressed men. The handsomest among them was a young prince with large black eyes. He could not certainly be more than 16 years old, and it was in honor of his birthday, and a grand festival was being celebrated. The crew were dancing on deck, and when the young prince appeared among them, 100 rockets were sent up into the air, turning night into day, and so terrifyingly the Little Mermaid But some more minutes she plunged beneath the water. However, she soon raised a little head again, and then it seemed as if the stars had fallen down about her. Such a fiery shower she had never seen before. Never had she heard that men possessed such wonderful powers. Large suns revolved around her. Bright fishes swam in the air, and everything was reflected perfectly on the clear surface of the sea. It was so light in the ship that everything could be seen distinctly. Oh, how happy the young prince was! He shook hands with the sailors, laughed and jested with them, while sweet notes of music mingled with silence of the night. It was now late, but the little mermaid could not tear herself away from the ship and the handsome young prince. She remained looking through the cabin window, rocked to and fro by the waves. There was a foaming and fermentation in the depths beneath, and the ship began to move faster and faster. The sails were spread, the waves rose high, thick clouds gathered over the sky, and the noise of distant thunder was heard. The sailors perceived that a storm was coming, and so they again furled the sails. The great vessel was tossed about on the tempestuous ocean like a light boat. The waves rose to an immense height, towering over the ship, which alternatively sank beneath and rose above them. To the little mermaid this seemed most delightful, but the ship's crew thought it very differently. The vessel cracked. The stout masts bent under the violence of the bellows. The waters rushed in. For a minute the ship tottered to and fro. Then the main mast broke, as if it was a reed. The ship turned over and was filled with water. The little mermaid now perceived that the crew was in danger, for she herself was forced to beware of the beams and splinters torn from the vessel and floating about on the waves. But at the same time it became pitch dark, so that she could not distinguish anything. Presently, however, a dreadful flash of light disclosed to her a whole wreck. Her eyes sought the young prince. The same instant the ship sank to the bottom. At first she was delighted, thinking that the prince must now come to her abode, but she soon remembered that man cannot live in water, and that therefore if the prince ever entered her palace, it would be as a corpse. No, he must not die. She swam through the fragments in which the water was strewn regardless of the danger she was incurring, and at last found the prince all but exhausted, and with great difficulty keeping his head above water. He had already closed his eyes, and must inevitably have been drowned, and not the little mermaid come to his rescue. She seized hold of him and kept him above water, suffering the currents to bear him on together. Towards morning the storm was hushed. No trace, however, remained of the ship. The sun rose like fire out of the sea. His beams seemed to restore color to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes were still closed. The mermaid kissed his high forehead and stroked his wet hair away from his face. He looked like the marble statue in her garden. She kissed him again and wished most fervently that he might recover. Now she saw the dry land with its mountains glittering in snow. A green wood extended along the coast, and at the entrance of the wood stood a chapel or convent. She could not be sure which. Citron and lemon trees grew in the garden adjoining it. An avenue of tall palm trees led up to the door. The sea here formed a little bay, in which the water was quite smooth, but very deep, and under the cliffs were dry, firm sands. Hither swam the little mermaid with the seemingly dead prince. She laid him upon the warm sand, and took care to place his head high, and to turn his face to the sun. Bells began to ring in a large white building which stood before her, and a number of young girls came out to walk in the garden. The mermaid went away from the shore, hid herself among some stones, and covered her head with foam, so that her little face would not be seen, and watched the prince with unremitting attention. It was not long before one of the young girls approached. She seemed quite frightened, finding the prince in the States, apparently dead. Soon, however, she recovered herself and ran back to call her sisters. The little mermaid saw that the prince revived, and that all around smiled kindly, joyfully on him. For her, however, he looked not. He knew not that it was she who had saved him. When the prince was taken into the house, she felt so sad that she immediately plunged beneath the water and returned to her father's palace. If she had been before quiet and thoughtful, she now grew even more so. Her sisters asked her what she had been seeing in the upper world, but she made no answer. Many an evening she rose to the place where she had left the prince. She saw the snow on the mountains melt, and the fruits of the garden ripen and gathered, but the prince she never saw, so she always returned sorrowfully to her subterranean abode. Her only pleasure was to sit in the little garden gazing at the beautiful statue so like the prince. She cared no longer for her flowers. They grew up in wild luxuriance, covered the steps, and entwined their long stems and tendrils among the boughs of the trees, so that her whole garden became a bower. At last, being unable to conceal her sorrow any longer, she revealed her secret to one of her sisters, who told it to the other princesses, and some of their friends. Among them was a young mermaid who recollected a prince, having been an eyewitness herself to the festivities of the ship. She knew also in what country the prince lived, and the name of its king. "Come, little sister," said the princesses, and embracing her, they rose together arm in arm out of the water, just in front of the prince's palace. This palace was built of bright yellow stones. A flight of white marble steps led up from the sea and up to it. A guided cupola crowned this building, and bright marble figures, which might almost have been taken for real men and women, were placed among the pillars surrounding it. Through the clear glass of the high windows, one might look into the magnificent apartments, hung with silken curtains, the walls adorned with magnificent paintings. It was a real treat to the little royal mermaids to behold so splendid an abode. They gazed through the windows of one of the largest rooms, and in the center they saw a fountain playing, whose waters sprang up so high as to reach the glaring cupola above, through which the sunbeams fell dancing on the water, and brightening the pretty plants which grew around it. The little mermaid now knew where her beloved prince dwelt, and henceforth she went there almost every evening. She often approached nearer the land than her sisters had ventured, and even swam up the narrow channel that flowed under the marble balcony. Here, on a bright moonlight night, she would watch the young prince, who believed himself alone. Sometimes she saw him sailing on the water in a gaily painted boat with many colored flags waving above. She would then hide among the green reeds which grew on the banks, listening to his voice, and if anyone in the boat noticed the rustling of her long silver veil, which was caught now and then by the slight breeze, they only fancied it as a swan flapping its wings. Many a night, when the fishermen were casting their nets by the beacon's light, she heard them talking of the prince, and relating the noble actions he had performed. She was then so happy, thinking how she had saved a life when struggling on the waves, and remembering how his head had rested on her bosom, and how she had kissed him when he knew nothing of it, and could never even dream of such a thing. Human beings became more and more dear to her every day. She wished that she were one of them. Their world seemed to her much larger than that of the merpeople. They could fly over the ocean in their large ships, as well as climb to the summits of those high mountains that rose above the clouds, and their wooden domains extended much farther than the mermaid's eye could perceive. There were many things that she wished to hear explained, but her sisters could not give her any satisfactory answer. She was again obligated to have recourse to the old Queen Mother, who knew a great deal about the upper world, which she used to call the country above the sea. "Do men, when they are not drowned, live forever?" she asked one day. "Do they not die as we do, who live at the bottom of the sea?" "Yes," was the grandmother's reply. "They must die like us, and their life is much shorter than ours. We live to an age of 300 years, but when we die we become foam on the sea, and are not allowed even to share a grave among those that are dear to us. We have no immortal souls, we can never live again, and are much like the grass which, once cut down, is withered forever. Human beings, on the contrary, have the souls that continue to live when their bodies become dust. And as we rise out of the water to admire the boat of man, they ascend to glorious unknown dwellings in the sky which we are not permitted to use." "Why have we not immortal souls?" asked the little mermaid. "I would willingly give up my 300 years to be a human being for only one day, thus to become entitled to a heavenly world above." "You must not think that," answered her grandmother. "It is much better as it is. We live longer and are far happier than the human beings." "So I must die and be dashed like foam over the sea, never to rise again and hear the gentle murmur of the oceans, never again see the beautiful flowers and the bright sun? Tell me, dear grandmother, are there no means by which I may obtain an immortal soul?" "No," replied the old lady. "It is true that if thou considerest so the affections of a human being as to become dearer to him than either father or mother, if he loved thee with all his heart, and promised whilst the priest joins his hands to thine to always be faithful to thee, then his soul would flow into thine, and thou wouldst become partaker of human bliss." Wow. "But that could never be. For what in our eyes is the most beautiful part of our body, the tail, the inhabitants of the earth think hideous. They cannot bear it. To appear handsome to them, a body must have two clumsy props, which they call legs." The mermaid sighed and looked mournfully at her scaly part of her form, otherwise so fair and delicate. "We are happy," added the old lady. "We shall jump and swim about merrily for 300 years. That is a long time, and afterwards we shall repose peacefully in death. This evening we have a court ball." The ball which the Queen Mother spoke of was far more splendid than any that earth has ever seen. The walls of the saloon were of crystal, very thick, and yet very clear. Hundreds of large mussel shells were planted in rows along them. These shells were some rose color, some green as grass, but all sending forth a bright light, which not only illuminated the whole apartment, but also shone through the glassy walls to light up the waters around the great space. and making scales of the numberless fishes, great and small, crimson and purple, silver and gold-colored, appear more brilliant than ever. Through the center of the saloon flowed a bright, clear stream, on the surface of which danced mermen and mermaids to the melody of their own sweet voices, voices far sweeter than those that dwelled upon earth. The little princesses sang more harmoniously than any other. They clasped their hands and applauded her. She was pleased at this, for she knew well that there was neither earth nor on sea a more beautiful voice than hers. But her thoughts soon returned to the world above her. She could not forget the handsome prince. She could not control her sorrow at not having an immortal soul. She stole away from her father's palace, and whilst all the joy was then, she sat alone and lost in thought of a little neglected garden. On a sudden she heard the tones and horns resounding over the water, far away in the distance, and she said to herself, "Now he is going out to hunt, whom I love more than my father and my mother, whom love my thoughts are constantly occupied, to whom all I could willingly trust happiness in my life. All will I risk to win him, and an immortal soul. Whilst my sisters are still dancing in the palace, I will go to the enchantress, whom I am hitherto feared so much, but who is, nevertheless, the only person who can advise and help me." Poor unfortunate souls. So the little mermaid left the garden and went to the foaming whirlpool beyond which dwelt the enchantress. She had never been this way before. Neither flowers nor seagrass bloomed along her path. She had to traverse an extent of bare gray sand till she reached the whirlpool, whose waters were eddying and whizzing like millweeds, carrying everything they could seize along with them into the abyss below. She was obliged to make her way through this horrible place in order to arrive at the territory of the enchantress. Then she had to pass through a boiling, slimy bog, which the enchantress called her turf moor. Her house stood in a wood beyond this, and a strange abode it was. All the trees and bushes around were polypi, looking like 100-headed serpents shooting up out of the ground. Their branches were long, slimy arms with fingers of worms, every member from the root to the uttermost tip, ceaselessly moving and extending on all sides. Whatever they seized they fastened upon, so that it could not loosen itself from their grasp. The little mermaid stood still for a moment, looking at this horrible wood. Her heart beat with a fear, and she would certainly have returned without retaining her object, had she not remembered the prince and immortality. The thought gave her new courage. She bound up her long waving hair, that the polypi might not catch hold of it, crossed her delicate arms over her bosom, and swifter than a fish can glide through the water, she passed these unseemly trees, who stretched out their eager arms after her in vain. She could not, however, help seeing that every polypus had something in its grasp, held as firmly as 1,000 little arms, as if enclosed by iron bands. The whitened skeletons of a number of human beings had drowned in the sea, and had sunk into the abyss, grinned horribly from the arms of the polypi. Helms, chests, skeletons of land animals were also held in their embrace, among other things that might have seemed even a little mermaid they had seized and strangled. What fearful sight for an unfortunate princess! But she got safely through this wood of horrors, and then arrived at a slimy place, where immense, fat snails were crawling about. And in the midst of this place stood a house built of the bones of unfortunate people who had been shipwrecked. Here sat the witch, caressing a toad in the same manner as some persons would pet a bird. The ugly fat snails called her chickens, or she called her chickens, and she permitted them to crawl about her. I know well what you would ask me for, princess. Your wish is foolish enough, yet it shall be fulfilled, though its accomplishment is sure to bring misfortune to you, my fairest princess. You wish to get rid of your tail, and to have instead two stilts like those of human beings, in order that young prince may fall in love with you, and that you may obtain an immortal soul. Is it not so? Whilst the witch spoke those words, she laughed so violently that her pet toad and snails fell from her lap. You come just to the right time, continued she. Had you come after sunset, it would not have been my power to have helped you before another year. I will prepare for you a drink with which you must swim to land. You must sit upon the shore and swallow it, and then your tail will fall and shrink up to the things men call legs. This transformation will, however, be quite painful. You'll feel as though a sharp knife passed through your body. All you take on after you have thus changed will say you are the loveliest child they've ever seen. You'll retain your peculiar undulating movements, and no dancer will move so lightly. But every step you take will cause you pain all but unbearable. It will seem as though you were walking on the sharp edges of swords, and your blood will flow. Can you endure all this suffering? If so, I will grant your request. Yes, I will, answered the princess, with a faltering voice, for she remembered her dear prince, and the immortal soul which her suffering might win. Only consider, said the witch, you can never again become a mermaid when you once have received your human form. You may never return to your sisters and your father's palace. And unless you shall win the prince's love to such a degree that he shall leave father and mother for you, you shall be mixed up with all his thoughts and wishes, and unless a priest join you by your hands, so that you will become man and wife, you will never obtain the immortality you seek. The morrow of the day on which he is united to another will see your death. Your heart will break with sorrow, and you will be changed to foam on the sea. Still, I will venture, said the little mermaid, pale and trembling as a dying person. Besides all this, I must be paid, and it is no slight thing that I require for my trouble. Thou hast the sweetest voice of all the dwellers in the sea, and thou thinkest by its means to charm the prince. This voice, however, I demand as my recompense. The best thing thou possessest I require in exchange for my magic drink, for I shall be obliged to sacrifice my own blood in order to give it the sharpness of a two-edged sword. But if you take my voice from me, said the princess, what will I have left with which to charm the prince? Thy graceful form, replied the witch, thy modest gait and speaking eyes. With such as these, it shall be easy to infatuate a vain human heart. Well now, hast thou lost courage? Put out by thy little tongue, that I may cut it off and make it for myself, in return for my magic drink. Be it so, said the princess, and the witch took up her cauldron in order to mix her potion. Cleanliness is a good thing, remarked she, and she began to rub the cauldron with a handful of snails and toads. And then she scratched her bosom and let a black blood trickle down into the cauldron, every movement throwing in new ingredients, the smoke from the mixture assuming such horrible forms as were enough to fill beholders with terror. And a moaning and groaning proceeded from it, which might be compared to the weeping of crocodiles. The magic drink at length became clear and transparent as pure water. It was ready. Here it is, said the witch to the princess, cutting out her tongue at the same moment. The poor mermaid was now dumb. She could neither sing nor speak. If the poultry should attempt to seize you as you pass through my little grove, said the witch, you have only sprinkled some of this magic drink over them, and that their arms will burn into 1,000 pieces. But the princess had no need of this counsel, for the poultry drew back instantly as soon as they perceived the bright phial that glittered in her hand like a star. Thus she passed through them, the formidable wood with more, and across the foaming mill stream. She now looked once again at her father's palace. The lamps in the saloon were extinguished, and all the family were asleep. She would not go in, for she could not speak if she did. She was about to leave her home forever. Her heart was ready to break with the sorrow of the thought. She stole into the garden and plucked a flower from the bed of each of her sisters as a remembrance. She kissed her hand again and again, and then she rose to the dark blue waters to the world above. The sun had not yet risen when she arrived at the prince's dwelling, and ascended those well-known marble steps. The moon still shone in the sky when the little mermaid drank the liquid contained from the vial. She felt it run through her like a sharp knife, and soon fell in a swoon. When the sun rose, she awoke, and felt a burning pain in all her limbs, but she saw, standing close to her, the object of her love, the handsome young prince, whose coal-black eyes were fixed inquiringly upon her. Full of shame, she cast down her own, and perceived instead of a long fish-like tail, she had hitherto borne 2 slender legs. But she was quite naked, and tried in vain to cover herself with her long, thick hair. The prince asked who she was, and how she had got there, and she, in reply, smiled and gazed upon him with her bright blue eyes, for alas, she could not speak. He then led her by the hand into the palace. She found that the witch had told her true. She felt as though she were walking on the edges of sharp swords, but she bore the pain willingly. On she passed, light as a zephyr, and all who saw her wondered at her light, undulating movements. When she entered the palace, rich clothes of muslin and silk were brought for her. She was lovelier than all that dwelt there. But she could not either speak nor sing. Some female slaves, gaily dressed in silk and gold brocade, sang before the prince and his royal parents, and one of them distinguished herself by her clear, sweet voice, which the prince applauded by clapping his hands. This made the little mermaid very sad, for she knew that she used to sing far better than that young slave. Alas, thought she, if he did but know that for his sake I had given away my voice forever. The slaves began to dance, our lovely little mermaid among them, stretching out her delicate white arms and hovering gracefully around the room. Every motion displayed more and more the perfect symmetry and elegance of her figure, and the expression which beamed in her speaking eyes touched the hearts of the spectators far more than the song of the slaves. All present were enchanted, but especially the young prince, who called his dear little foundling. And she danced again and again, though every step cost her excessive pain. The prince then said she would always be with him, and accordingly a sleeping place was prepared for her on velvet cushions in the anteroom of his own chamber. He's keeping her like a pet. The prince caused a suit of male apparel to be made for her, in order that she might accompany him on his rides. So together they traversed the fragrant woods, where green boughs brushed against their shoulders, and the birds sang merrily among the fresh leaves. With him she climbed the steep mountains, and although her tender feet bled, so they remarked by the attendants, she only smiled and followed her dear prince to the heights, whence they could see the clouds chasing each other beneath them, like a flock of birds migrating to other countries. During the night she would, when all the palace were at rest, walk down the marble steps in order to cool her feet in the deep waters. She would then think of those beloved ones who dwelt in the lower world. One night, as she was thus bathing her feet, her sisters swam together to the spot, arm in arm and singing, but alas, so mournfully. She beckoned to them, but they immediately recognized her, and told her how great the mourning was in her father's house for her loss. From this time the sisters returned every night to visit. Then once they brought with them the old grandmother, who had not seen the upper world for many years. They likewise brought their father, the Mer-King, with his crown on his head. But these two old people did not venture enough to the land to be able to speak to her. The little mermaid became dearer and dearer to the prince every day, but he only looked upon her as a sweet, gentle child, and the thought of making her his wife never entered his head. And yet his wife she must still be, ere she could receive an immortal soul. His wife she must be, or she would change into foam, and be restlessly driven over the billows of the sea. Dost thou not love me above all others? Her eyes seemed to ask, as he pressed her fondly in his arms and kissed her lovely brow. Yes, the prince would say, thou art dearer to me than any other, for no one is as good as thou art. Thou lovest me so much, thou art like a young maiden who I have seen but once, and may never see again. I was aboard a ship, which was wrecked in a sudden tempest. The waves threw me on the shore near a holy temple, where a number of young girls are occupied consistently with religious services. The youngest of them found me on the shore and saved my life. I saw her only once, but her image is so vividly impressed on my memory, and her alone I can only love. But she has belonged to the holy temple, and thou who resemblest her so much hast been given to me for consolation. Never will we be parted. Alas, he does not know that it is I who saved his life, thought the little mermaiden, sighing deeply. I bore him over the wild waves, into the wooded bay where the holy temple stood. I sat behind the rocks and waited until someone could help. I saw the pretty maiden approach, whom he loves more than me, and again she heaved a deep sigh, for she could not weep. He said that the young girl belongs to the holy temple. She never comes out into the world, so they cannot meet each other again. and I am always with him. See him daily. I will love him, and devote my whole life to him." "So the prince is going to be married to the beautiful daughter of the neighboring king," said the courtiers. "That is why he is having such a splendid ship fitted. It is announced that he wishes to travel, but in reality he goes to see the princess. A numerous routine will be accompanying him." The little mermaid smiled at these similar conjectures, for she knew the prince's intentions better than anyone else. "I must go," he said to her. "I must see the beautiful princess as my parents require me to do so. But they will not compel me to marry her, and I will bring her home as my bride. It is quite impossible for me to love her, for she cannot be like the beautiful girl in the temple as thou art. And if I were obliged to those, I should prefer thee, my little silent foundling, with those speaking eyes." And he kissed her rosy lips, playing with her locks and folding her in his arms, whereupon arose her heart a sweet vision of human happiness and immortal bliss. "Thou art not afraid of the sea, art thou, my sweet silent child?" asked he tenderly as they stood together in the splendid ship, which was to take them to the country of the neighboring king. And then he told her of the storms that sometimes agitate the waters, of the strange fishes that inhabit the deep, and of the wonderful things seen by divers. She smiled at his words, for she knew better than any child on earth what went on beneath the ocean. At night time, when the moon shone brightly, and when all on board were fast asleep, she sat in the ship's gallery, looking down at the sea. It seemed to her, as she gazed through the foamy track made by the ship's keel, that she saw her father's palace and her grandmother's silver crown. Then she saw her sisters rise out of the water, looking sorrowfully and stretching out their hands towards her. She nodded to them and smiled, and would have explained that everything was going to be quite according to her wishes. But just as the cabin boy approached, upon which the sisters plunged beneath the water, so suddenly that the boy thought that what he had seen was the waves and nothing but foam. The next morning the ship entered the harbor of the king's splendid capital. Bells were rung, trumpets sounded, and the soldiers marched in procession through the city, with waving banners and glittering bayonets. Every day witnessed some new entertainments, balls or parties followed by each other. The princess, however, was not yet in the town. She had been sent to a distant convent for education, and had been there taught the practice of royal virtues. At last she arrived at the palace. The little mermaid was anxious to see this unparalleled princess. She was now obligated to confess that she had never before seen so beautiful a creature. The skin of the princess was so white and delicate that the veins might be seen through, and her dark eyes sparkled beneath a pair of finely formed eyebrows. "It is herself!" exclaimed the princess when they met. "It is she who saved my life when I lay like a corpse on the seashore." And he pressed his blushing bride to his beating heart. "Oh, I am so happy," he said to his dumb foundling. "What I never dared hope has come to pass. Thou must rejoice in my happiness, for thou lovest me more than all others who surround me." And the little princess kissed his hand in silent sorrow. It seemed to her as if her heart was breaking already, although the morrow of his marriage day, which must inevitably see her death, had she not yet dawned. Again rang the church bells, and whilst heralds strode through the streets of the capital to announce the approaching bridal, odorous flames burned silver candlesticks on all the altars. Priests swung their golden censers, and bride and bridegroom joined hands, whilst the holy words that united them were spoken. The little mermaid, clad in silk and cloth of gold, stood behind the princess, and held her train for the bridal dress. But her ear heard nothing of the solemn music. Her eyes saw not the holy ceremony. She remembered her approaching end, and remembered that she had lost both this world and the next. That very same evening, bride and bridegroom went on board the ship. Cannons were fired, flags waved in the breeze, and in the center of the deck stood a magnificent pavilion of purple and gold, cloth of gold, fitted with the richest and softest couches. There, the princely pair were to spend the night. Favorable winds swelled the sails, and the ship glided lightly over the blue waters. As soon as it was dark, colored lamps were hung out, and dancing began on the deck. The little mermaid was thus involuntarily reminded of what she had seen the first time she rose to the upper world. The spectacle that now presented itself was equally splendid, and she was obligated to join in the dance, hovering lightly as a bird over the shipboards. All applauded her, for she never had danced with more enchanting grace. Her little feet suffered extremely, but she no longer felt the pain. The anguish of her heart suffered her much greatly. It was the last evening she might see him, for whose sake she had forsaken her home and her family, and given away her beautiful voice, and suffered daily the most violent pain, all without his having the least suspicion of it. It was the last evening that she might breathe the same atmosphere in which he, the beloved one, lived. The last evening when she might behold the deep blue sea, and the starry heavens, and eternal night, which she might neither think nor dream awaited for her. And all was joy in the ship, and she, her heart filled with thoughts of death and annihilation, smiled and danced with the others till past midnight. Then the prince kissed his lovely bride, and arm in arm they entered the magnificent tents prepared for their repose. All was now still. The steersman alone stood at the ship's helm. The little mermaid leaned her white arms on the gallery and looked towards the east, watching for the dawn. She well knew that the first sunbeam would witness her disillusion. She saw her sisters rise out of the sea. Deadly pale were their features. Their long hair no matter fluttered over their shoulders. It had all been cut off. "We have given it to the witch," said they, "to induce her to help thee, so that thou mayest not die. She has given to us a penknife. Here it is. Before the sun rises, thou must plunge it into the prince's heart, and when his warm blood trickles down upon thy feet, they will again be changed to a fish-like tail. Thou wilt once more become a mermaid, and wilt live fully 300 years, ere thou changest to foam on the sea. But hasten, either he or thou must die before sunrise. Our aged mother mourns for thee so much her grey hair has fallen off from sorrow, and ours fell before the scissors of the witch. Kill the prince! Come down to us! Hasten, hasten! Dost thou not see the red streaks in the eastern sky, announcing the near approach of the sun? A few minutes more, and he rises, then all will be over for thee." At these words they sighed deeply and vanished. The little mermaid drew aside the purple curtains of the pavilion, where lay the prince and his bride. Bending over them, she kissed the prince's forehead, then glanced at the sky. She saw that the drawing light became every moment brighter. The prince's lips unconsciously murmured the name of his bride. He was dreaming of her, and only her. whilst the fatal penknife trembled in the hand of the unhappy mermaid. All at once, she threw far out to sea the instrument of death. The waves rose like a bright blazing flames around, and the water where it fell seemed tinged with blood. With eyes fast becoming dim and fixed, she looked once more at her beloved prince, then plunged from the ship into the sea, and felt her body slowly but surely dissolving into foam. The sun rose from its watery bed. Its beams fell so softly and warmly on her that her little mermaid was scarcely sensible of dying. She still saw the glorious sun. Her head hovered over 1,000 beautiful, transparent forms. She could still distinguish white sails from the ships, the bright red clouds in the sky. The voices of those airy creatures above her had a melody so sweet and soothing that a human ear would be able to catch the sound if her eye was capable of distinguishing their forms. They hovered around with her without wings, borne by their own lightness through the air. The little mermaid at last saw that she had a body as transparent as theirs, and felt herself raised gradually from the foam to the higher regions. "Where are they taking me?" asked she, and her words sounded like the voices of the heavenly beings. "Speak you to the daughters of air," was the answer. "The mermaid has no immortal soul, but can only acquire that heavenly gift by winning the love of one of the sons of men. Her immortality depends upon union with man. Neither do the daughters of the air possess immortal souls, but they can acquire them by their own good deeds. We fly to hot countries, where the children of earth are sinking under sultry pestilent breezes. Our fresh, cooling breeze revives them. We diffuse ourselves through the atmosphere. We perfume it with the delicious fragrance of flowers, thus spread delight and health over the earth. By doing good in this manner for 300 years, we win immortality and receive a share of the eternal bliss of human beings. And thou, poor little mermaid, who, following the impulse of thine own heart, hast done and suffered so much that thou art now raised to the airy world of spirits. By performing deeds of kindness for 300 years, thou mayest acquire an immortal soul." The little mermaid stretched out her transparent arms to the sun. For the first time in her life, tears moistened her eyes. And now, again, all were awake and rejoicing on the ship. She saw the prince with his pretty bride. They had missed her. They looked sorrowfully down at the foamy waters, as if she knew they had plunged into the sea. Unseen, she kissed the bridegroom's forehead, smiled upon him, and then, with the rest of the children of the air, soared high above the rosy cloud which was sailing so peacefully over the ship. "After 300 years we shall fly in the kingdom of heaven." "We may arrive there even sooner," whispered one of the sisters. "We fly invisibly through the dwellings of men, where there are children, and whether we find a good child who gives pleasure to his parents and deserves their love, God shortens our time for probation. No child is aware that we are flirting in his room, and that whatever joy draws us smile and smile, a year is struck from our 300. But when we see a rude, naughty child, we weep bitter tears of sorrow. For every tear we shed adds a day to the time of our probation." Okay. I knew the whole seafoam incident thing about it, but I never know the becoming a child of the air. have to admit, that was good news for me. Kind of a happier ending, I guess. Being around good children to help people get noticed faster. That's good to know. Let's see how long this is for. Okay. Let's see, that one was 35 pages. The next one would be 20 pages. I didn't set a ending time on this, so what the hell? I'm going to continue reading. Because, why the hell not? The next story. Be really weird and do this. Title. Oh, that didn't change much. Because this one starts once upon a time, so. Another familiar fairy tale. This would be that of Thumbelina. Once upon a time, there lived a young wife who longed exceedingly to possess a little child of her own. So she went to an old witch woman and said to her, "I wish so very much to have a child, a little tiny child. Won't you give me one, old mother?" "With all my heart," replied the woman. "Here's a barley corn for you. It is not exactly the same sort of those that grow in a farmer's fields, or that are given to fowls in the poultry yard. But do you sow it in a flower pot, then you shall see what you shall see." Thank you," cried the woman. And she gave the witch a silver sixpence. Ooh, nice. And then, having returned home, sowed the barley corn as she had been directed, whereupon a large and beautiful flower immediately shot forth from the flower pot. It looked like a tulip, but the petals were tightly folded up. It was still in bud. What is it? I can make myself forget chucklings, but... "What a lovely flower!" exclaimed the peasant woman, and she kissed the pretty red and yellow leaves, and as she kissed them the flower gave a loud report and opened. It was indeed a tulip, but on a small green pothole in the center flower there sat a tiny little girl, so pretty and delicate, but her whole body was scarcely bigger than that of the peasant's thumb. So she called her Thumbelina. A pretty varnished walnut shell was given to her as a cradle. Blue-violet leaves served as her mattress, and a rose leaf was her coverlet. There she slept at night, but in the daytime she played on her table. The peasant wife had filled a plate with water, laid flowers in it. Their blossoms bordering the edge of the plate, while the stalks lay in the water. On the surface floated a large tulip leaf, and on it Thumbelina might sit and sail from side to side of the plate. 2 white horsehairs having been given to her for oars. That looked quite charming. And Thumbelina could sing too, and she sang in such a sweet low tones that never were heard before. One night, while she was laying in her pretty bed, a great ugly toad came hopping in through the window of a broken pane. The toad was such a great creature, old and withered looking, and wet too. He hopped at once down onto the table where Thumbelina lay sleeping under the rose petal. "This is just the wife for my son," said the toad, and she seized the hold of the walnut shell with Thumbelina in it, and hopped away through the broken window pane into the garden. Here flowed a broad stream. Its banks were muddy and swampy, and it was amongst this mud that the old toad and her son dwelt. How hideous and deformed he was, just like his mother. "Don't make such a riot, or you'll wake her," said the old mother toad. "She may easily run away from us, for she is as light as a swan-down feather. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take her out to the brook, set her down on one of those large water lily leaves. It'll be like an island to her. It is so light and small. Then she'll not run away from us, and we can easily go and get ready for the staterooms under the mud, where you and she are to dwell together." Out in the brook there grew many water lilies, with their broad green leaves, each of which seemed to be floating over the water. The leaves, which were the farthest from the shore, were also the largest. To it swam old Mother Toad, and on it she set the walnut shell with Thumbelina. The poor little tiny creature awoke quite early the next morning, and when she saw where she was, she began to weep most bitterly, for there was nothing but water on all sides of the large green leaf, and she could in no way reach the land. Old Mother Toad was down in the mud, decorating her apartments with bushels and yellow buttercups. This makes such quite gay and tidy to receive her new daughter-in-law. At last, she and her frightful son swam together to the leaf where she had left Thumbelina. They wanted to fetch the pretty cradle and place it for her in the bridal chamber before she herself was conducted into it. The old Mother Toad bowed low in the water and said to her, "Here is my son. He is to be thy husband, and you will dwell together so comfortably down in the mud." "Grogs, grogs, brickeke," was all her son could say. Then they took the neat little bed and swam away with it, while Thumbelina sat alone on the green leaf, weeping, for she did not like the thought of living with the withered old toad, and having her ugly son for a husband. Can you blame her? The little fishes that were swimming to and fro in the water beneath had heard what Mother Toad had said, so now they put up their heads. They wanted to see the little maid. And when they saw her, they were charmed with her delicate beauty, and it vexed them so much that the hideous toad should carry her off. No, that should never be. They surrounded the green stalk on the water, whereupon rested the water lily leaf, and gnawed it asunder with their teeth, and then the leaf floated away down the brook, with Thumbelina on it. Away, far away from the old toad could not follow. Thumbelina had sailed past so many places, and the wild birds among the bushes saw her and sang, "Oh, what a sweet little maiden!" On and on. Farther and farther floated the leaf. Thumbelina was on her travels. A pretty little white butterfly kept fluttering around and around her, and at last it settled down on the leaf, for he loved Thumbelina so very much, and she was so pleased. There was nothing to trouble her now that she had no fear of the old toad pursuing, and wherever she sailed everything was so beautiful, for the sun shone down on the water, making it bright as liquid gold. And now she took off her sash and tied one end of it around the butterfly, fastening the other end firmly to the leaf. On floated the leaf, faster and faster, Thumbelina with it. Presently a great cockchafer came buzzing past. He caught sight of her and immediately fastened his claw around her tender waist and flew up to a tree with her. But the green leaf still floated down the brook, with the butterfly on it. He was bound to the leaf and could not get loose. Oh, how terrified the poor Thumbelina was when the cockchafer carried her up in the tree. How sorry she felt, too, for the darling little white butterfly that she had left tied fast to the leaf. She feared that it would not get away and would perish of hunger. But the cockchafer cared nothing for that. He settled with her upon the largest leaf of the tree and gave her some honey from the flowers to eat, and hummed her praises, telling her that she was very pretty, although she was not at all like a henchafer. And by all the other chafers who lived in the tree came by to pay her a visit. They looked at Thumbelina, and then one Miss Henchafer drew one of her feelers, saying, "She only has 2 legs. What miserable looks! She has no feelers," cried another. "See how thin and lean her waist is. She's just like a human being," said the third. "How very, very ugly she is," at last cried all the lady chafers in chorus. The chafer who had carried off Thumbelina still could not persuade himself that she was otherwise than pretty. But, as all the rest kept repeating and insisting that she was ugly, he at last began to think that he must not be right, and determined to have nothing more to do with her. She might go wherever she would, for aught he cared. And so the whole swarm flew down from the tree with her, and set her on the daisy. Then she wept because she was so ugly that the lady chafers would not keep company with her, and yet Thumbelina was the prettiest little creature that could have ever been imagined, soft and delicate, and as transparent as the loveliest rose-leaf. All the summer long, poor Thumbelina lived alone in the wide world. She wove herself a bed of straw grass and hung it underneath a large burdock leaf which sheltered her from the rain. She dined off of honey from the flowers, and drank from the dew of the every morning spangled leaves and herbs around her. Thus passed the summer and autumn. But then came winter, a cold, long winter. All the birds who had sung so sweetly to her flew away. Trees and flowers withered. The large burdock leaf under which Thumbelina had lived rolled itself up and became a dry yellow stalk. And Thumbelina was fearfully cold, for her clothes were wearing out, and she herself was so slight and frail, poor little thing. She nearly froze to death. It began to snow, and every light flake that fell upon her made her feel like as we would a whole shovelful of snow thrown down on us. For we are giants in comparison with a little creature only an inch long. She wrapped herself up in a withered leaf, but it gave her no warmth. She shuddered with cold. Close outside the wood, and on the skirt of which Thumbelina had been living, lay a large cornfield, but the corn had been carried away long ago, leaving only a dry, naked stubble standing up from the hard frozen earth. It was like another wood to Thumbelina, and oh, how she shivered with cold as she made her way through. At last she came to the field mouse's door, for a field mouse had made itself a little hole under the stubble. and there she dwelt snugly and comfortably, having a room full of corn, and a neat kitchen and store chamber besides. And poor Thumbelina must now play the beggar girl. She stood at the door and begged for a little piece of barley corn, for she had had nothing to eat for whole 2 days. "Thou poor little thing," said the field mouse, who was indeed a thoroughly good-natured old creature, "come into my warm room and dine with me." And as soon as she took a great liking to Thumbelina, she proposed to her to stay. "You may dwell with me all winter if you will, but keep my room clean and neat and tell me stories, for I love stories dearly." And Thumbelina did all that the kind old field mouse required of her, and was made very comfortable in her new abode. "We shall have a visitor presently," observed the field mouse. "My next-door neighbor comes to see me once every week. He is better off than I am. He has large rooms in his house, and wears such a black velvet cloak. It would be a capital thing for you if you could secure him for your husband. But unfortunately he is blind. He cannot see you. You must tell him you are the prettiest stories you know." But Thumbelina did not care at all about pleasing their neighbor, Mr. Mole, nor did she wish to marry him. He came and paid a visit in his black velvet suit. He was so rich and so learned, and the field mouse declared his domestic offices were 20 times larger than hers. But the sun and pretty flowers he could not endure. He was always abusing them, though he had never seen either. Thumbelina was called upon to sing for his amusement, and by the time she had sung, Lady bird, fly away home," and our Friar of Orders Grey, the mole had quite fallen in love with her through the charm of her sweet voice. However, he said nothing. He was such a prudent and cautious animal. He had just begun digging a long passage through the earth from their house to his, and now gave permission to the field mouse and Thumbelina to walk in as often as they had liked. However, he bade them not be afraid of the dead bird that lay in the passage. It was a whole bird, with beak and feathers entire, and therefore he supposed it must have died quite lately, at the beginning of the winter, and had been buried just in the place where he had begun to dig his passage. The mole took a piece of tinder, which shines as though fire in the dark, in his mouth, and went on first to light his friends through the long dark passageway. And when they came to the place where the dead bird lay, he thrust his broad nose up against the ceiling and pushed up the earth, so as to make a great hole for the light to come through. In the midst of the floor lay a swallow, his wings clinging firmly to his sides, his head and legs drawn under his feathers. The poor bird was evidently died of cold. Thumbelina felt so very sorry, for she loved all the little birds, who had sung and chirped so merrily to her the whole summer long. But the mole kicked it with his short legs, saying, "Here's a fine end to all its whistling. Miserable thing, it must have been born a bird. None of my children will be birds, that's a comfort. Such creatures have nothing but their quivet, and must be starved to death in the winter." "Yes, indeed, a sensible animal like you may well say so," returned the field mouse. "What has a bird got by all its chirping and chirruping? When winter comes it must starve or freeze. Such a great creature, too." Thumbelina said nothing, but when the 2 others had turned their backs upon the bird, she bent over it, smoothed down the feathers, and covered its head. Then she kissed its closed eyes. "Perhaps it was this one that sang so beautifully to me in the summer-time," she thought. "How much pleasure it has given me. The poor, dear, dear bird." The mole now stopped up the hole with which the daylight had pierced and followed the ladies home. But Thumbelina could not sleep that night, so she got out of her bed and wove a carpet out of the hay. Then she went out and spread it over the dead bird. She also fetched some soft cotton from the field mouse's room, which she laid over the bird, that it might be warm until mid-cold air. "Farewell, thou dear bird," she said. "Farewell, and thanks for thy beautiful song in the summer-time, when all the trees were green, and the sun shone so warmly on us." And she pressed her head against the bird's breast. I was terrified to feel something beating within it. It was the bird's heart. The bird was not dead. It had laid in swoon, and now that it was warmer, life had returned. Every autumn, when the swallows fly to warm countries, but if one of them linger behind, it freezes and falls down as though dead, for the cold snow covers it. Thumbelina trembled with fright, for the bird was very large compared to her, who was only an inch in length. However, she took courage and laid the cotton more closely to the poor swallow, and fetched a leaf which had served itself as a coverlet, and spread it over the bird's head. The next night she stole out again, and found that the bird's life had quite returned, though it was so feeble that only for one short moment could it open its eye to look at Thumbelina, who stood by with a piece of tinder in her hand. She had no other lantern. "Thanks to thee, thou sweet little child," said the sick swallow. "I feel delightfully warm now. Soon I shall recover my strength and be able to fly again, out into the warm sunshine." "Oh no," she replied. "It is too cold without. It snows and it freezes. Thou must stay in the warm bed, and I will take care of thee." She brought the swallow water in a flower petal, and he drank. Then he told her how he had torn one of his wings in a thorn bush, and therefore could not fly fast enough to keep up with the other swallows when they were migrating to the warm countries. He had at last fallen to earth, and more than that he could not remember. He did not know how he had gotten underground. However, the underground he remained all winter long, and Thumbelina was kind to him and loved him dearly. But she never said a word about him to either the mole or the field mouse, for she knew they could not endure the poor swallow. As soon as the spring came and the sun's warmth had penetrated the earth, the swallow bid farewell to Thumbelina, and she opened for him the covering of earth which the mole had thrown back before. The sun shone down on him so deliciously the swallow asked whether she would go with him or not. She might sit on his back, and then they would fly away together to the greenwood. But Thumbelina knew it would vex the old field mouse if she were to leave her. "No, I cannot. I must not go," said Thumbelina. "Farewell to thee, then, thou good and pretty maiden." And the swallow flew away into the sunshine. Thumbelina looked after him, and tears came to her eyes, for she loved the poor swallow so much. "Quivet, quivet," said the bird as he flew into the greenwood. And Thumbelina was now sad indeed. She was not allowed to go out to the warm sunshine. The wheat that had been sown in the field above the mouse's house grew up so high that it seemed a perfect forest to the poor little damsel, who was only an inch in stature. "This summer you must work on getting your wedding clothes ready," said the field mouse. For the neighbor, the blind dull mole, in the black velvet suit, had now made his proposals in the form of Thumbelina. "You shall have horse and linen aplenty. You shall have well provided in all manner of clothes and furniture before you become the mole's wife." So Thumbelina was obligated to work hard in the stuff, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders to spin and weave night and day. Every morning came the mole, and They always began to talk of the summer soon coming to an end. And then that when the sun would no longer shine so warmly, scorching the earth till it was day as dry as stone, and his nuptials with Thumbelina would take place. This sort of conversation did not please her at all. She was thoroughly wearied of his dullness and his prating. Every morning when the sun rose, and every evening when it set, she used to steal out to the door, and when the wild wind blew the tops of the corns aside, she knew that she could see the blue sky through the opening. She thought how beautiful and bright it was out there, and wished most fervently to see the dear swallow once more. But he never came. He must have been flying far away in the beautiful greenwood. Autumn came, and Thumbelina's wedding clothes were ready. 4 more weeks, and you shall be married, said the field mouse. But Thumbelina wept, and said she worried that meant she did not want to marry the mole. Fiddlestick! Exclaimed the field mouse. Don't be obstinate, child, or I shall bite thee with my white teeth. He's not handsome, pray. Why, the queen has not so much a black velvet dress as he wears. And isn't he rich? Rich both in kitchens and cellars. Be thankful to get such a husband. So Thumbelina must be married. The day was fixed and arrived. The mole had already come to fetch his bride, and she must dwell with him, deep under the earth, never again to come out to see the warm sunshine which she loved so much, and which he could not endure. The poor child was in despair at the thought she must now bid farewell to the beautiful sun of which she had at least been allowed to catch a glimpse of every now and then. She lived with a field mouse. Farewell, thou glorious sun, she cried, throwing her arms up into the air. As she walked on the little way beyond the field mouse's door, the corn was already reaped, and only the dry stubble surrounded her. Farewell, farewell, repeated she as she clasped her tiny arms around a little red flower that grew there. Greet the dear swallow for me, if thou shouldst see him. Scrivet, scrivet! There was a fluttering of wings just over her head. She looked up, and, behold, the little swallow was flying past. And how pleased he was when he perceived Thumbelina. She told how she must be obligated to accept the disagreeable mole as a husband, and that she would never see the sun, for she would dwell in the deep underground. And she could not help but weep as she spoke. Cold winter will be here soon, said the swallow. I shall fly far away to the warm countries. Wilt thou go with me? Thou canst sit on my back, and tie thyself with me to the sash, and thus we shall fly away from the stupid mole in his dark room, far away over the mountain to the other countries where the sun shines so brightly. There is always summer, and always blossoms all year round. Come and fly with me, thou sweet little Thumbelina, who just saved my life when I lay frozen in the dark cellars of the earth. Yes, I will go with thee, said Thumbelina, and she seated herself upon the bird's back, her feet resting on his outspread wings. She tied her girdle firmly around the strongest feathers, and then the swallow soared high into the air and flew away over forest and over lake, over mountains whose crests are covered with snow all year round. How Thumbelina shivered as she breathed the keen frosty air. However, she soon crept down under the bird's warm feathers, her head still peering forth, eager to behold all the glory and beauty beneath her. At last they reached the warm countries. There the sun shone more brightly than native climates. Heaven seemed twice as high and twice as blue, and ranging along the sloping hills grew in rich luxuriance the loveliest green and purple grapes. Citrons and melons were seen in the groves. The fragrance of myrtles and balsams filled the air, and by the wayside gamboled groups of pretty merry children, chasing large, bright-winged butterflies. But the swallow did not rest there. He flew on, and still seemed to grow more and more beautiful. Near a calm blue lake, overhung by lofty trees, stood a half-ruined palace of white marble, built in times long past. Vine wreaths trailed up long, slender pillars, and on the capitals, among the green leaves and waving tendrils, many a swallow had built a nest, and one of the nests belonged to the swallow whose back Thumbelina was riding. "This is my house," said the swallow, "but if thou wouldst rather choose for thyself one of the most splendid flowers glowing beneath us, I will take thee there, and thou shalt make thy home in the loveliest of them all." "That would be charming!" exclaimed she, clapping her tiny hands. On the green turf beneath lay the fragments of white marble column, which had fallen to the ground, and around these fragments twined some beautiful large white flowers. The swallow flew down with Thumbelina and set her on one of the broad petals. But what was her surprise when she saw sitting in the very heart of a flower a little mannikin, fair and transparent as though he were made of glass, wearing the prettiest gold crown on his head, and the brightest, most delicate wings on his shoulders, yet scarcely one whit larger than Thumbelina herself. He was the spirit of the flower. In every blossom there dwelt one such fairy youth and maiden, and this one was the king of all these flower spirits. "Oh, how handsome he is, this king," whispered Thumbelina to the swallow. The fairy prince was quite startled at the sudden descent of the swallow, who was a sort of giant compared to him. But when he saw Thumbelina, he was delighted, for she was the loveliest maiden he had ever seen. He took off his gold crown and set it upon her head, and asked her name and whether she would be his bride, reign as queen over all the flower spirits. You see, this was quite a different bridegroom from the son of the ugly toad, with a blind mole on his black velvet coat. So Thumbelina replied yes to this beautiful prince, and then the lady and gentleman fairies came out, each from a separate flower, to pay their homage to Thumbelina. So gracefully and courteously she paid their homage, and every one of them brought her a present. But the best of all the presents was a pair of transparent wings. There they fastened on Thumbelina's shoulders, and enabled her to fly from flower to flower. That was the greatest of pleasures, and the little swallow sat in his nest above and sang to her his sweetest song. In his heart, however, he was very sad, for he loved Thumbelina, and would have wished her never part from him. "Thou shalt no longer be called Thumbelina," said the king of the flowers, "for it is not a pretty name. And thou art so lovely, we shall call thee Maia." "Farewell, farewell," sang the swallow, and away he flew from the warm countries, far back to Denmark. There he had a little nest just over the man, to write stories for children. "Quivet, quivet, quivet," he sang to him, and from him we have learned this story. Okay. Well, oddly enough, that put us to the 2-hour mark, and my vision is blurry as well. Let's see. I didn't see any alert saying anyone came in, so I don't know if anyone's here or not. But if you did, thank you for coming in. Now let's see if I can read the screen well enough to find someone to raid, shall we? Oh, man, I really can't see. Hmm. Let's see, who's on? Oh, Pop Penguin's on. Seems like a likely target, so let's go. Oh, check to see what it's doing first. He is. Damn, can't read. Oh, he's playing a hack, okay. Something else. Blade. Yeah, this is a Pop Penguin. Let's see if that isn't right. Oh, I cannot type it right. Okay, Pop Penguin VT. Again, thank you, Cubs, for coming in, and we'll see you later. Again, you have other stuff going on next week, so good night. Sleep well, Cubs. Hang on for the raid. Oh. And start it now.